Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great opportunity also for me to be speaking about the work that we've been doing. This is mostly the work that we've been doing with collaborators and across Europe, but also the work at Imperial College London and the starting work that we're doing at UCL, University College London. And essentially, it's the framing is how do we incorporate lived experience in the way that we do research on altered states or non-ordinary states or whatever you want to call them. And this, so I'm going to go over that general principle, the model that we established with colleagues around how do we incorporate that in the way that we do science. And then the examples with our recent research involving mostly psychedelic drugs, such as DMT and 5-MeO, and I'll explain what each of these drugs do and why they are relevant for the study of the human mind and brain. And then also our research with meditation. And so it's a bit of like case examples of how do we do this kind of research and the things that we're trying out, the things that we're finding out, and maybe, an exploration of what could be what's missing in that as well. And so this approach is something that was a collaborative effort we developed with this Mind and Life group, Mind and Life Europe group. We got together and we tried to figure out what is kind of common across these different altered states of consciousness. We wrote a paper with it together with Antoine, who's also going to present here tomorrow. And we kind of shifted our focus. Instead of trying to map out these commonalities and differences, we thought that that was way too premature. It'd be better if we would establish this as a form of intention-setting sort of approach. So what is the way that we can develop a framework through which we can start to develop these overlaps and differences, so that we can better learn the phenomena at hand. And the essential premise is that these non-ordinary states of consciousness are particularly relevant for the study of the mind and brain because they're very effective at perturbing the mind and brain in somewhat specific ways, depending on the etiology at hand. And so by perturbing them, that can enable a sort of revelation or revealing of these different facets of the mind and brain. And specifically, non-ordinary states are those states, how we define it, that affect these core features of human experience. A good example is the idea of the sense of self. And so by perturbing, we can better understand the system. And so the general statement is a very basic one. And so we can think of our human experience as being represented in this quadrant above. We don't need to worry about those dimensions. And we can think of an usual ordinary state of consciousness as that represented in this point A, and the perturbation induced by the non-ordinary states, psychedelics, meditation, so forth and so on. And then the resulting state, you would get sort of like an average state B. And this would be the conventional approach in which we do usually this kind of research. We do it in basis of averages. And in parallel to that, we get a snapshot of brain dynamics or brain activity for an ordinary state of consciousness, and we get the resulting alteration induced by meditation, psychedelic hypnosis, so forth and so on. And so we average across individuals and within individuals, within the trajectory of their own experience. And so by incorporating lived experience in the best rigorous ways that we can have, for example, two participants that may, at a glance, both start in a similar point A and at a glance finish at a relatively similar point B in this experience space. And if we would ignore the dynamics of experience, we would tend to think that they're broadly having a similar kind of experience. But by incorporating lived experience in the way that we do the scientific approach, we can map those trajectories and actually reveal these aspects of experience that matter so much for us, like what is happening in terms of their conscious experience. And by doing that, we can also leverage the dynamics of brain activity that is happening for each of these individual participants. And so that distinction, that sort of better mapping of those trajectories would allow us to get a better distinction of what is true signal in the brain data at hand and what is actually noise. And I'll provide some examples in that direction. And this approach, the neurophenomenological approach, is very much based on the work of Francisco Varela, who seeks to respond to the hard problem of consciousness, which is first postulated by David Chalmers, of how do we explain the intimate subjective qualities of human experience in a third-personal natural world. And so this explanatory gap that is a recurrent theme for many, many years in philosophy. And so Varela, in his proposal of neurophenomenology, he says this is an unsolvable gap. It's an unsolvable tension. It's very much constitutive to our human experience. And so rather than try to solve the explanatory gap, it's kind of like a pragmatic approach of how we start to begin addressing these sort of things by incorporating lived experience in the ways that we do science. And the more radical sort of statement is that experience is not necessarily an epiphenomenon of the brain. It's a good hypothesis, but we cannot really know that. And because we cannot assert safely that it's epiphenomenon of the brain, we should incorporate it in the ways that we do science in a similar kind of rigor and importance. And so the broad sort of project here is how do we introduce that level of rigor that we usually apply to the third person data to the ways that we understand human experience as well. And so why employ psychedelics to study consciousness? I'm now going to move to the specific examples and the role that psychedelics have in the ways that we can understand the brain and the mind. And the very general proposal here is that these psychedelic drugs, they perturb these features of human experience, and psychedelic drugs can also be a very good proxy to understand how we construct these core features and how they can be deconstructed in the brain and mind. And if you deconstruct them, what is left in the brain and mind as well. It's a very simple sort of idea. And so, for example, you would have a short-acting psychedelic, 5-MeO, that is particularly efficient at deconstructing the sense of self, the several features of the sense of self, the narrative sense of self, the embodied sense of self, the sense of time and space, for example. And you have a very similar, structurally similar psychedelic, which is DMT, which instead constructs this world analog of sorts, where individuals feel detached from the immediate environment, and they have a very intense, vivid, dream-like experience where they feel that they're inhabiting what they describe as an alternate dimension or reality, and they interact with these beings or entities. 5-MeO they're both naturally occurring substances as well. So 5-MeO, you can find it in the glands of the bufo alvarius toad, and DMT you can find in the brew ayahuasca. It's a very known, very popular these days brews that has been used for hundreds, maybe 1,000 years in the Amazon, in Latin America, DMT. And the use of 5-MeO, we don't know much of its lineage of use. It's kind of debated. It's generally thought that it's kind of a new phenomenon. And there are also very intense experiences that are evoked by both of them. So I'm going to start with the example of deconstructing these features of the mind, especially the sense of self, with the use of this 5-MeO substance. And so first start with what I think has been the largest contribution of psychedelic research, the study of consciousness more broadly, which is this idea of self-dissolution, that these these states induced by LSD, psilocybin, 5-MeO, and so forth and so on, have a perturbation on these different features of the sense of self. And so, for example, in this human work that was led by Robin Carhart Harris, they found that increased scores of ego dissolution were related to the disconnection of the parahippocampal gyrus and the retrospinal cortex. And so the parahippocampal gyrus playing an important role in semantic memory and episodic memory, and so therefore possibly related to aspects of the narrative self which are perturbed. There's also evidence that decreased hippocampal glutamate also correlates with increased course of ego dissolution, again pointing to this idea that the narrative autobiographical sense of self is perturbed under psychedelic states. We also have some evidence that shifts in criticality, more specifically reductions in signatures of criticality in the brain, correlate also with ego dissolution. And so these occur in the alpha wave and slower frequencies, which sort of hints towards a longer term of processing in the brain and therefore somewhat related to the narrative sense of self. But we also have some evidence pointing towards structures that are perturbed that relate to the embodied self, that are also perturbed by psychedelic drugs, that also correlate with this course of ego dissolution. So for example, it has been found, this is evidence from one study, that hyperconnectivity of the insula correlates with increased course of ego dissolution as well. And then some preliminary data that at some point I will publish, I hope, where we found a very strong decrease of the heart-evoked potential. So the heart-evoked potential is this neural marker that you can find in the EEG. On every single heartbeat, you have this marker that some ECOG data has linked to be happening in the insula as well. And so evidence pointing to disruptions in the narrative self, in the bodily self, and the big problem really is that most of this research is based on a single item in a questionnaire, which is what is your level of ego dissolution? And the problem is that people don't know even what the ego is unless they're trained in psychoanalysis, and even those trained in psychoanalysis, I think, it can even have these sort of polysemic sort of attribution. And so the project here is to refine the ways that we define these things and how do we relate to the brain. And so I became particularly interested in the recent work by Thomas Metzinger of proposing an alternative approach to the study of consciousness, not so much focusing on the NCC, the neural correlates of consciousness, but understanding consciousness in its most basic or minimal form as an attractive avenue to understand the basic features of the mind that we care so much about. And so this minimal phenomenal experience as this particularly strong case study to approach consciousness to study in its most basic form. The simplest model of consciousness, he says, is the best way to study consciousness, a state where you would have minimal contents of experience, where, however, awareness is preserved. And he has a particular emphasis on meditation to achieve these states. And so getting to these states and understanding the brain mechanisms could refine the relationship between the sense of self and consciousness and try to address some fundamental questions in philosophy for thousands of years. So for example, can you have an experience without any sense of self? Is the sense of self constitutive or non-constitutive for consciousness to occur? And I was fascinated by some reports that I was seeing of people having these 5-MeO drug experiences where they would report a form of so-called pure awareness. And if you would have a pharmacological model to have this minimal experience, then you would have, in my opinion, great advantages over alternative ways to try to get to this compared to meditation. And so one of the reasons is that you would have a minimization of this theory contamination that they say. So when meditators report upon their experiences, they've cultivated a practice that occurs in a cultural milieu that sets a lot of expectations and suggestions about the state at hand. And so it's said that reportability could be somewhat contaminated. Also, for meditators, it's very hard to achieve these states. You would need very, very advanced meditators to get there. Some people practice and never really achieve these endpoints. And I think very importantly for the project at hand, if you would have a pharmacological model for it and you know how this drug is acting in the body and hitting the receptors, first you would get a good pharmacological model of it and understand the relationship of these receptors and, for example, the sense of self, which is very important. But also you could interrupt it in real time and you would have potentially the expectation that the person could then come back to that experience after you've interrupted it. And so I'm going to show some evidence in that regard. So this is our most recent lab study using 5-MeO, where 5-MeO was given intranasally to healthy volunteers. And we had experienced sampling of a rating of no self. And so this happened in repeated moments during the administration. And that's the line, that first blue line, the peak one. And so what we find here is that we have like this kind of fairly long 8-minute peak of this no self rating. And then what we did is after we had these ratings of no self, and then we had an interview with the participant using this method called microphenomenology, which is attempts to reduce the biases of reportability. And we're using it in creative ways so that we can, together with the participant, establish how facets of the sense of self were also disrupted over time. And so a sense of the narrative self-dissolution and the bodily self-dissolution. So we're trying to get to a form of dissociation of at least these broad features of the sense of self as they occur over time. And what's nice I find about these findings is that this is intranasal form of 5-MeO. People, and so it's kind of long. The peak, the whole range of the experience, I'd say, is 40 minutes. So they're still at rating 5 then on average. And so it's very difficult to estimate it. And if you look at the trajectory of the plasma levels of MEO in this administration, they really match these ratings. And so it's can you hear me? I think it's, yeah. So it's a very nice, it points towards something that I think right now that this is a valid way to study self-dissolution, I think. There's variability within the response, it's not perfect, but something we're seeing that is matching the levels of the drug in the blood that tell us something that is meaningful. Okay, great. But before we could do that lab study, it took us really, we're talking about this with the Uber, with Evan, it took us 2 years to get the approvals. And so we just went out in the field and see what people were doing anyway, and captured the phenomenology using this microphenomenological interview method. And with that, we developed this model of the experience that have different stages. But the important is that in a third of the participants, at the peak of the experience, we identified this stage that we refer to as an everything and nothing stage, where there was no sense of space, no time, no sense of self, and no distinctions in the contents of consciousness. An experience of awareness as such. This is just a quote from one of the participants. "I was not there. It was like I was accessing whiteness, quiet, blissful, enormous whiteness. I was everything. There was no controller or observer. It was not me. I don't know what happened. I somehow had a glimpse of the wholeness or totality of things." And so many participants describe it as a saturation sort of effect of experience. It's not that you have a sense of nothing at all, but that you have so many possibilities, affordances, if you will, of contents of the experience that nothing is really ultimately grasped and materialized into a single percept. And the preliminary findings, we also went with EEGs. They're not perfect EEGs, it's not amazing. What we found is overall strong reductions of alpha power and posterior beta power. And alpha power is, there's many interpretations about what alpha power is in EEG, but broadly we can think of it as a sort of inhibitory effect or a sort of like a pattern in terms of brain activity that keeps everything in check. It has also been linked with backwards connectivity and the influence of top-down activity and so forth in the brain. And also the narrative sense of self, very broadly defined, and the posterior beta power reductions that we found here have sometimes been described related to motor activity and then potentially maybe with the embodied sense of self. So this is very preliminary sort of statements to make, but overall a sense of disinhibition in terms of brain activity. And also, just going to skip this one. It's just some animal work that is showing somewhat contradictory findings, but also consistent in other ways. But in essence, pointing towards this idea, so for the sake of time, I'm just going to skip what it is, but the evidence pointing towards 5-MeO and DMT as a state of disconnected consciousness, but which is somehow preserving awareness, so disconnected from the environment, which is somehow preserving awareness. And so just a toy model, please not to take very, very seriously, but I think an intuitive way that we can understand this is by, the way that we can map this in these sort of icing models. These models where you tune the temperature And at the right range of critical temperature, you would see these patterns emerging. And so the idea would be that in the habitual experience, at this right critical temperature, you would reach a level where you would have patterns emerging in the brain and mind, manifesting as contents of experience, a sense of self, emotions, thoughts, etc., etc. If you reduce the temperature, you would have no experience at all, and it's broadly, similar to what we find in terms of sleep or anesthesia, where you would have reduced complexity, reduced entropy, and also no reportability of experience. And so one would have a guess that potentially, this sort of minimal experience would be occurring somewhere in between these two states. But this evidence of disinhibition in terms of brain activity points towards something a bit different, really, sort of like an increase in temperature, increase in entropy, which intuitively matches to this idea of an everything and nothing experience happening, sort of like a saturation point effect, where also with 5-MeO you have increased arousal and autonomic response. And so in that other sort of direction. And so, because it was initially formulated as a state of pure awareness, this minimal phenomenal experience in meditators, we became very interested in understanding how this could occur in an advanced practitioner. And so we had a case study with Lama, an expert meditation practitioner with 17 years of retreat experience. I may be wrong. How much is it, Anton? You know? 10 years of retreat experience. So the meditator that it's a collaboration also that we did with Antoine. He's from a traditional practice, Mahamudra tradition, and underwent 2 meditation sessions and 2 5-MeO DMT sessions in the lab. So we gave him low dose and a high dose of 5-MeO, and we also studied the brain with high density EEG. And so this is the psychometric response. There's a lot of items here, so I'm just going to point your attention towards some of the things that showed some level of overlap. For example, positive emotions, a feeling of gaining intuitive knowledge, the general intensity of the experience, feelings of timelessness, of having no body, no perceptual center, no identity, no self-location, with various degrees of intensity reported. And also we found that the 5-MeO kind of won the meditation in some of these features of being disconnected from the environment and seeing this white light in the 5-MeO that was not reported really at all in the non-dual meditation state. And importantly, we also find this elevated score of a NYAM, which is broadly defined as an intense experience that is encountered in meditation that sometimes practitioners feel is a hindrance to their practice. The idea is that you're trying to not get attached to specific experiences. But that is also part of the practice, which is why it's reported also high in the non-dual state. And then there were other features that the practitioner only identified as strong in the non-dual experience, and they were very specific to the endpoints of the non-dual practice. And so we're finding some similarities, some differences overall. This is the categorizations from the interviews, just to get a sense. Again, there's a lot of information, but what I want to point out is that there's some overlap with the low dose of 5-MeO and the non-dual state. We're mostly focusing on this, the second session, which was better scored overall over the first one. And in essence, somehow reduced amount of thoughts, reduced sense of the narrative and the embodied self in many of these states, and few phenomenal distinctions. But importantly, in the 5-MeO, again, a sense of sensory disconnection that is not present in the non-dual state. And so in the non-dual state, the practitioner speaks about actually perceiving input from the environment, but somehow deconceptualizing that. That's in essence the practice. It's not about detaching from the environment, but simply not have any of these phenomena sort of with a form of grasping or fixation. And so starting to understand the differences between these states. Then in terms of brain activity, again, there's a lot of different neural markers, and we can speak about that. But in essence, we find a form of overlap with the low dose of 5-MeO instead of the high dose of 5-MeO. In terms of entropy metrics, which relate to this sort of like toy model that I was mentioning before, a reduction of entropy in the low dose and in the non-dual, an increase in entropy in the high dose of 5-MeO. And so we have this weird sort of nonlinear effects, maybe with the low dose, the high dose of 5-MeO, but we also find a form of increase in the placebo case, maybe because of the feeling of increased autonomic response. So yeah, we're still trying to make sense of this. But much more importantly, when looking at the overlaps between these non-dual states and all the other conditions, we found a significant overlap with an accuracy of like 95% between the low dose and the non-dual state in the brain. And when looking at the features that mostly contributed to this effect, we found that it was related to reduced gamma power, mostly posterior gamma power, and some reductions in frontal gamma power as well. And so, in a way, gamma power is usually thought to be somewhat of a proxy of fMRI response or metabolism or brain activity, very broadly defined. And so the idea here would be that in this non-dual state and in the low dose of 5-MeO, you would have some overlapping brain effect that relates rather than to the sort of like massive increase in noise and entropy and so forth, actually in the other direction. So a quieting down in terms of brain activity and brain dynamics. So also going to skip this, some preliminary findings on other forms of advanced meditation. And I think what's important and relevant to mention here is that we're finding these overlaps, but also these differences in terms of psychedelic use and meditation. And one of the key aspects here, and it's very much baked into our neurophenomenological approach, is the way that the context is also shaping these experiential qualities, these specific states, and the disposition that the practitioner or the drug user has when they are having these experiences as well. And so in essence, the idea would be that the context plays a key role in how both states and traits are developed and they unfold over time in altered states of consciousness or non-ordinary states. And more specifically, the context biases the trajectory of a specific non-ordinary state of consciousness. So we can think of, for example, the initial model where we have the initial perturbation of the drug experience or the meditation experience, but the context as well forms a specific form of perturbation that can radically bias the outcome of the specific non-ordinary state of consciousness. And so we have to include our descriptions of context, the ways that context interacts with the specific perturbations at hand. And we have emerging psychedelic evidence in this regard, in the psychedelic different studies, sort of like the intuition that has been not fully researched yet, but that the historical context of the organism plays a key role in the qualities of experience that they will report after the experience has been had. The role of music in the context both of psychedelic therapy and the specific phenomenology evoked by a psychedelic session. So this is very early research showing how, for example, overtone types of music can lead to more mystical-like experiences and also to improvement in terms of these markers of addiction, reductions of addiction or addictive behaviors following psychedelic therapy. It's very early evidence, but it points towards, again, the influence of specific context biasing the state and also the clinical response. And then emerging fMRI work, which is now testing the effects of psychedelics in a range of different contexts in the scanner. So this is fMRI work where they employ some form of dimensionality reduction to the brain data. And what you find here is that the strongest the intensity of the psychedelic experience, here measured with the mystical experience questionnaire, the stronger the differentiation of the brain states to different contexts. And so in a way, the idea would be here that psychedelics sensitizes the brain to the particularities of contexts. That would be the general idea. And so again, just emphasizing the role of context in the way that we understand these altered states. Okay, and so exploration of deconstruction of these features of the sense of self with 5-MeO, and how is it that we're studying these ideas of how we build these novel worlds of experience with DMT instead, and then dimethyltryptamine. And so one of the two features of the DMT experience that we felt was particularly important to understand these elements of reconstruction was the feeling of immersion into an alternate world during these experiences and the encounter of these entities and beings. So we have this preprint out for anyone interested of how we employ these microphenomenological interviews and how we then formalize them or mathematize them to perform further research. And so I'm just going to skip the immersive one. I'm going to go to the entity encounters one. And one of the things that we found was that in most cases, we found a specific trajectories of these structures of experience where there would be some form of alteration to multisensory qualities of experiences, usually visual and bodily effects, then a sense of being immersed in a 3D space. So the person is having visual hallucinations, but not just having them. The participants feel that they are in the scene in a 3D sort of environment, so kind of like a VR kind of way. And only then, in most of these cases, the presences would appear, these entities encounters would appear. So speaking about like a form of sophistication that is unfolding over time in the ways that these worlds are constructed, with social cognition or the experiences of encountering these entities as occurring later on. And in one of the studies that we had, that we were again matching the phenomenology with the subjective experiences, we first mapped out the theory of mind network of individuals in the scanner with a localizer task. And after doing that, we looked at the connectivity between the theory of mind network with all the other brain regions, and we found that when these entity encounters were happening, the areas related to social cognition, language, and first perception were particularly enhanced. And so pointing towards some form of neural correlate that is intuitive when we're thinking about these elements of building these worlds, specifically social cognition during DMT experiences. So this study that I've just spoken about was done with a specific kind of way where we just give a bolus injection of DMT, so short-acting, peaking for 1 or 2 minutes, and then going down gradually. So within 15 minutes, you have that whole experience. And we're asking, or trying to map out that entity encounter that happens in that 1 minute. But there's a lot of stuff happening also within that last minute, not just these entity encounters. You have emotional effects, you have visual effects, you have a strong autonomic response, and so forth and so on. By the way, these are drawings from our participants in case you're curious about these. How do they look to the participants? So we thought it'd be better to have a model of injecting or administering the drug that would be extended over time, so that then we could map out variability of the entity response within and between individuals. And so we employed an experience sampling approach in real time, asking people if they saw an entity, yes or no. And that variability would allow us to then enable much better contrasts when looking at the brain data. And that's what we did. And so what we found was that when people were having the DMT infusion and they had no reports of entity encounters, so the broad DMT experience without entities versus placebo, what we found was this broad disinhibitory effect, so reductions of alpha and beta power and increases in entropy rate. The moment that participants were now, like we contrasted the reports of entities versus no entity encounters, what we found was a reduction of that disinhibitory effect. So a form of momentary inhibitory effect when these forms of reconstruction of experiences were emerging. And so going back to our little model here, we can think of these moments of reconstruction as something happening in between the increases of the noise and the habitual temperature. So you would have like this dynamic emergence of contents where the system is pushing towards organization again in the midst of this chaos, if you will. And it's tempting to say that a lot of the emergence of content, not just these entities, would respond to this principle in the psychedelic state, and how it can be leveraged as well in clinical practice in a way that, in essence, understanding the dynamics of those experiences, the unfolding of therapeutic insights, for example, that people can have, can also follow this principle. And I think also potentially has important implications to clinical practice. And so just broad conclusions of what we find is this, again, just emphasizing how the experience of deconstruction in the psychedelic state, at least, I think in meditation we're finding something a bit different. But in the psychedelic state is we would have this flattening of the attractor landscape. We imagine sort of like a bowl that's in this mental or brain landscape, requires a certain amount of energy to have a movement between states. If you would flatter the attractor landscape, you would require much less energy. And so the brain and the mind just visit much more states. And broadly, the evidence is fair, kind of consistent with that idea. And so you would have a rich amount of contents. And if you would get it to the extreme, you would have this minimal phenomenal experience. Whereas in reconstruction features during the DMT state or potentially other psychedelic states, you would have these sort of like momentarily normalizing of the landscape. Instead of just being flat, you would have again these hills and valleys momentarily and these reductions of entropy. And so the emergence of structure or contents are happening. And so the idea here would be that the minimal phenomenal experience that we care about as a model to understand the mind and brain is indexed by an increase in contents, surpassing potentially the capacity of attention or the brain and mind to make meaningful gestalts out of it. I think our evidence with a meditator and the low dose of 5-MeO, however, points to this minimal phenomenal experience really happening, maybe even here in this direction and the other one. So again, talking about a diversity of what we're trying to map out with different etiologies. And so consistent with what has been described by many individuals and a lot of traditional texts in some advanced meditator practices as well, a form of epistemic openness. And also important to mention that what we're seeing in some individuals in the peak moments of experience in DMT and 5-MeO, that experience is potentially lost. Reportability is at least lost. We don't know if it's an amnesic effect or if it's a loss of consciousness per se. And so the idea, I think intuitively, is that if you further increase the entropy or the temperature, consciousness would just fall out. And so you would have a sort of like this, like, I don't know how you could, like inverted U-shaped thing, where at both extremes you would have loss of consciousness and consciousness contents emerging somehow in that critical point. And I think more broadly in terms of the idea of neurophenomenology and the method, I think what we're finding with these studies is that if we examine the neural correlates of an experience as a whole without looking into the details, we tend to make assumptions of the brain state that we're looking as increases in entropy or just noise and characterizing it as such. However, when we guide the way that we do science and we analyze that data based on phenomenology, we get to better distinctions of signal versus noise. So that's essentially what we found with the entity sort of encounter method and experience. And so, yeah, thank you for your attention.